Reverend Elias Thorne stood at the pulpit, the morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows of the First Baptist Church of Havenwood, painting the congregation in hues of crimson and gold. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the sanctuary, speaking of divine grace, of suffering as a test of faith, and of the unwavering love of a benevolent God. For 20 years, Elias had preached these truths, his faith a bedrock, unshakable and absolute. He believed in a world ordered by divine will, where even the deepest sorrows served a higher purpose, leading to ultimate redemption. His flock, a community built on tradition and shared belief, looked to him as their spiritual compass, their guide through life's inevitable storms. He was a man of the cloth, yes, but also a man of the people. He visited the sick, comforted the grieving, and celebrated every birth and marriage with genuine joy. He saw the good in everyone, even those who strayed, believing that a spark of the divine resided within every soul. His faith was not just a doctrine. It was the very lens through which he viewed existence. Then came Sarah. She arrived in Havenwood like a whisper on the wind, a woman shrouded in quiet mystery. She bought the small, dilapidated cottage on the edge of town, far from the church and the bustling main street. Her clothes were always modest, long skirts and high-necked blouses, even in the summer heat. Her face, though unlined by age, carried a profound weariness in her eyes, a perpetual shadow that seemed to cling to her. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost a murmur. The town, accustomed to its insular rhythms, regarded her with suspicion. Rumors like insidious weeds began to sprout. She was a runaway, some said. A woman with a past, whispered others, their eyes narrowed with judgment. Elias, though he preached compassion, found himself observing her with a subtle, paternalistic pity. He saw a lost lamb, a soul in need of guidance, perhaps even salvation. He tried on occasion to offer a kind word, a gentle invitation to Sunday service, but Sarah would always offer a polite, distant smile and a quiet refusal. She kept to herself, a solitary figure against the backdrop of Havenwood's close-knit community. The storm hit Havenwood with a ferocity no one had anticipated. Days of relentless rain had swollen the Haven River, and by Tuesday afternoon, it had burst its banks, transforming the sleepy town into a churning, muddy expanse. Houses were submerged, roads became treacherous currents, and the cries for help echoed through the deluge. Elias, shedding his clerical collar for a sturdy waterproof jacket, was at the forefront of the rescue efforts. He organized volunteers, directed emergency services, and personally waded through the rising waters, pulling stranded residents from their homes. His faith, in these moments of crisis, felt like a tangible force, a divine hand guiding his actions, giving him strength. He was God's instrument, bringing comfort and aid to his suffering flock. Late in the afternoon, as the rain began to subside but the floodwaters remained dangerously high, a desperate call came in. Sarah's cottage, built on lower ground near the river, had been completely engulfed. No one had seen her since the storm began. "She is probably gone," a volunteer muttered, shaking his head. That house was right in the path. But Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable urgency. He remembered her quiet, haunted eyes, her solitary existence. He couldn't leave her. "We have to try," he declared, grabbing a coil of rope. "She's still one of us." He, along with 2 other volunteers, navigated a small, battered rescue boat through the debris-filled currents towards Sarah's submerged cottage. The water was waist-deep even in the boat, swirling with treacherous force. As they approached, a chilling sight met their eyes. The cottage roof had collapsed, and a section of the wall had given way. Amidst the splintered wood and floating wreckage, they saw her. Sarah. She was trapped. A heavy wooden beam, dislodged from the roof, had pinned her lower body against the remains of a wall. The water swirled around her, threatening to pull her under. Her face was ashen, her lips blue, but her eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on them. "Help me," she rasped, her voice barely audible over the rush of water. Elias immediately began assessing the situation. The beam was too heavy to lift by hand. They needed to secure her, then try to leverage it. He saw that her right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, likely broken, and her long, sodden skirt was tangled around the beam, holding her fast. The fabric, heavy with water, was pulling her down, making it impossible to free her. "We need to get this skirt off her, Reverend," one of the volunteers yelled, gesturing at the fabric. "It's pulling her under." Elias nodded, reaching for his utility knife. He knew the protocol. In an emergency, modesty was secondary to life. He would cut the fabric, free her, and then attend to her injuries. It was a simple, logical step. He knelt in the churning water, reaching for the hem of her skirt. "No," Sarah cried, her voice suddenly sharp, piercing through the chaos. Her eyes filled with a raw, desperate terror locked onto his. "Please, don't lift my skirt." Elias paused, his hand hovering. Her plea was not just fear. It was anguish, a primal scream of vulnerability. It was a plea he had never heard before, not from anyone in such a desperate situation. Most people, in the face of death, would shed any pretense of modesty. But Sarah, her plea was absolute. "Sarah, we have to," Elias said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're trapped. The fabric is pulling you down. We need to get you free. It's the only way." "No, please. Anything but that." Her voice rose to a near shriek, tears mingling with the rain on her face. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from a deeper, more profound fear. Don't lift it, please." Elias hesitated. Her desperation was unnerving. It went beyond simple modesty. It was a plea for something far more fundamental, something he couldn't quite grasp. But the water was rising and Sarah was fading. He was a man of God, a rescuer. He had a duty, a life was at stake. He looked into her eyes, seeing the terror, the pleading. His heart ached for her, for whatever hidden pain lay beneath that desperate plea. But he had to act. He had to save her. With a heavy heart and a silent prayer for forgiveness, Elias made his decision. He reached down, his fingers closing around the sodden hem of her skirt. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with regret, and then he lifted. The world for Reverend Elias Thorne fractured in that instant. It wasn't a simple injury beneath the skirt. It was a nightmare. They looked like burn scars, but not from a single incident. They looked like burn scars, but not from a single incident. They looked like burn scars, but not from a single incident. And then he saw the ankle that was pinned. It wasn't just broken. The skin around it was also heavily scarred, and one of the old scars, a particularly deep, jagged one, had reopened, oozing fresh blood into the murky water. The skin around it was also heavily scarred, and one of the old scars, a particularly deep, jagged one, had reopened, oozing fresh blood into the murky water. The skin around it was also heavily scarred, and one of the old scars, a particularly deep, jagged one, had reopened, oozing fresh blood into the murky water. The skin around it was also heavily scarred, and one of the old scars, a particularly deep, jagged one, had reopened, oozing fresh blood into the murky water. Elias gasped, a sound of pure horror. His hand, still holding the skirt, trembled violently. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, cold and sudden. He looked at Sarah's face. The shame, the humiliation, the raw exposure of her deepest, most guarded secret was etched onto her features. She hadn't been begging for modesty. She had been begging for her dignity, for the preservation of a secret that defined her suffering. In that moment, standing in the cold, muddy water, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, Elias Thorne's faith, his absolute, unshakable faith, shattered. In that moment, standing in the cold, muddy water, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, Elias Thorne's faith, his absolute, unshakable faith, shattered. He had always believed in a just God, a benevolent creator who allowed suffering only for a greater purpose, a divine plan. But what purpose could this serve? What divine plan could include such systematic, prolonged, unspeakable torment inflicted upon an innocent soul? He saw no test, no redemption, only raw, inexplicable cruelty. The world, which he had seen as fundamentally good, ordered by a loving hand, suddenly revealed itself as a place of unfathomable darkness, a place where evil could leave such indelible marks, hidden and unpunished. His God, the God of comfort and justice, seemed to vanish, replaced by a terrifying void. They managed to free Sarah. Elias, moving on instinct, his mind reeling, helped lift the beam, and they carefully pulled her into the boat. He wrapped her in a blanket, trying to shield her scarred legs from view, from the eyes of the other volunteers, from his own horrified gaze. He tended to her broken ankle as best he could, his hands still trembling. He kept his eyes averted from her lower body, but the image was burned into his mind, an infernal brand. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, her physical injuries severe, but her emotional wounds, now exposed, were far deeper. Elias stayed with her until her family, distant relatives she rarely spoke of, arrived. He tried to offer words of comfort, but they felt hollow, meaningless. What comfort could he offer in the face of such profound, unearned suffering? In the days that followed, the floodwaters receded, and Havenwood began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. But for Elias, nothing would ever be rebuilt. The foundation of his faith had crumbled. He stood before his congregation the following Sunday, the stained glass windows still casting their beautiful light, but he saw only shadows. His sermon, usually vibrant and full of conviction, was halting, strained. He spoke of resilience, of community, of the need to help one another, but the words of God felt like ashes in his mouth. He couldn't speak of divine purpose, of a loving plan, not when the image of Sarah's legs, a silent scream of human depravity, haunted his every waking moment. His parishioners noticed the change. The light in his eyes seemed dimmed. His once powerful voice now carried an undertone of profound weariness. His sermons became less about salvation and more about the raw, unvarnished reality of human suffering, about the need for compassion in a world that often seemed devoid of it. He spoke of doubt, of questioning, of wrestling with darkness, topics he would have considered sacrilege just weeks before. He still visited the sick, but now he saw their pain with a new, sharper clarity, unbuffered by the comforting veil of divine intervention. He comforted the grieving, but felt the raw, illogical agony of loss more acutely, without the easy solace of reunion in an afterlife. He prayed, but his prayers felt like whispers into an empty void. He searched for God, but found only silence. The certainty, the joy, the absolute conviction that had defined his life were gone. He was a preacher who had lost his faith, or at least the faith he had once known. She disappeared as quietly as she had arrived, leaving no trace but the lingering memory of her silent suffering and the scars she carried. Elias never saw her again. He never knew the full story of her past, the source of those horrific marks. He didn't need to. The marks themselves were enough. He continued to serve as Reverend Thorne, but he was a different man. His sermons, while perhaps less inspiring in their traditional sense, were now imbued with a raw, empathetic honesty that resonated with some, unsettling others. He spoke less of miracles and more of the quiet heroism of enduring. He spoke less of divine judgment and more of human responsibility. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit in the empty sanctuary, the only sound the creaking of the old wooden pews. He would close his eyes, and the image would rise unbidden. Sarah's face, contorted in desperate plea, and then the horrifying landscape of her legs exposed in the murky water. He had saved her life, yes, but in doing so, he had seen a truth that had stripped him bare, leaving him with a profound, aching emptiness where his unwavering faith once resided. He had lifted her skirt, and in that act, he had not only exposed her deepest wound, but had also torn away the comforting illusions of his own soul. He was a man forever changed, a preacher who had seen the true face of human suffering, and in that sight, had lost his faith only to find perhaps a deeper, more painful, but ultimately more authentic understanding of humanity itself. The light through the stained glass still shone, but for Elias, the colors were forever muted by the shadow of what he had seen.